All right, welcome to the Gateway API sync for August 22nd. Just as a reminder, this meeting is covered by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which pretty much boils down to being nice to each other. And the agenda is open for anyone to put anything that they want on it. If you are looking to add something to the agenda, just make a comment in chat if you don't have a copy of the doc, and we can send you a link.
Did you intend to share your screen, Shay?
I am about to.
Cool.
Was I already doing it? I didn't know.
No, you were not.
Okay. All right. Sorry, August 22nd, 2022. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I had a couple of topics that I wanted to talk about. So I'll start with, I was thinking about this from the perspective of the implementations that I maintain. So it would be nice if there were scaling semantics within the gateway resource itself, or within Gateway API, potentially. And I wanted to just throw this out there as something for discussion. If other people feel like this could be a cool thing, or feel like there's significant pitfalls to doing this, but the basic idea that you would have instances, and I won't say pods, in our case it's pods, but I know like in Rob's case with Google, it'll be instances somewhere else. Instances of gateway that you would potentially scale horizontally. So should there be something within the spec to allow you to basically do that? Curious if people just have thoughts on that.
I'll say we, being console, added scaling semantics to our gateway class config. It feels like one of those.
The same thing.
Yeah, it feels like one of those traps where you might get stuck just proxying config values through forever. But I don't know.
Yeah, that's one of my concerns would be just that that it's hard to decide where the limits are on what you pass through. Like I know there are a lot of reasonable requests in this realm, and one of the other ones I've seen was basically how on a gateway you could communicate what kinds of service type load balancer configuration you wanted for, you know, a lot of implementations are provisioning a service type that will be in front of their gateway. And so trying to pass config through that way was also, it seems like a very similar concept here of gateway specific configuration. And Shane, I think you mentioned, you know, like what we would do on what Google would theoretically do if we ever made this configurable. I think it would be probably a different gateway class, or, you know, a different gateway class config. So that overlaps a bit with what it sounds like console is already doing. I don't want to say this doesn't make sense. It just we have to be careful with anything we add to a gateway because, you know, we have to be very calculated in what the scope of a gateway is and what is we're just templating other resources. Yeah, but I'll hand it off to, I think, Keith, you had next.
Yeah, I share some of the concerns that Rob brought up. It feels to me like the Gateway API up to this point has been very much describing actions that the data plane should take when handling traffic routing or policy attachment. It's describing actions the data plane should take. Management of the data plane, that is management of the compute behind the data plane, seems to be in a related, but still, to me, it's related, but it's a separate concern. And, you know, should the Gateway API have, you know, should gateway management fall under the purview of the Gateway API? Maybe. Gamma has some interesting use cases here when it comes to sidecarless mesh or other mesh configuration. But that's a can. My gut tells me that that's a can we likely want to kick down the road until we've got more concrete. Well, the use case is clear. I guess what I'll say is that if that's decided to be a part of the Gateway API, it should be a completely separate thing. Because I can just already see the collisions between the existing routing APIs and then gateway management and crossing of concerns, and it doesn't look fun from where I'm sitting.
I mean, yeah, I see where you come from.
So is the question I would want to ask you, Shane, is the thing that you would like to be able to do is to be able to be like cube kettle scale gateway?
I mean, that would be cool. One of the things that I put up in the notes here was and like, again, I didn't even make this a discussion because I already realized some of the problems with it and more or less just thought I'd like to talk it out. But I did think it would be really cool if we could have gateways be the target of autoscaler. So like, for instance, the HPA could actually target gateways in additions to like, that might be wrong too, but it was a thought that I had, and it was kind of a little bit where this was all driven from. So I'm actually in the middle of figuring out what scaling is going to look like. And I've done exactly what I'm sorry, I don't recognize voices very well, but the person from council said, we have a gateway configuration that's used through parameters referenced in gateway class. And that's how you would do it today. But in our operator, like you would deploy a gateway, and then theoretically you would have, let's say, traffic, or I mean, you could have some of the basic stuff that you get with like the non-custom metrics for an autoscaler or something like that, but you could definitely have like traffic-based custom metrics that would lead you to need additional instances of the underlying pods for that gateway, right? And having that something that the spec accounts for seemed like neat to me. Does anybody just like that just would not work at all in their setup? I'd be curious to hear. Is like, nope, that just would break everything. That is not interesting.
I mean, to me, it sounds like it probably would work, but it really, I think the thing that it scares me for some reason, right? Like, and I think it scares me because it feels like there's going to be a lot of definition required for like, what do you mean by loaded? You know, how do you define like what traffic is important, and you know, what metrics are you going to use and stuff like that. And I mean, we've had some stuff open for a while about like, how do you produce standard metrics for the sort of stuff that we're talking about. And I know there was some work done in SMI about that. But so I think like, it kind of feels like, I agree that this would be cool to have, but like I think it'd be cool to have, but I really feel like it's almost like we got a chicken and egg problem here, that we need implementations to try it out to be like, that works, that doesn't work, to me. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, as far as things that just don't work, this is something that is not meaningful to the implementation at GKE, right? It's something like, I don't want to get in the way of something that is clearly useful for a large number of implementations, but it's something that would not be meaningful to us. It's something that we can't translate to anything.
Yeah, your use case is actually the biggest detracting thing from my perspective. So like, on one hand, I was like, it makes some sense because at least in our implementation, a gateway ultimately becomes a deployment, right? And you can scale a replica set directly if you felt like doing that, versus the deployment, which is a higher level API. And it would seem to make sense that as you go higher, you know, there's still some things that you could configure. On the other hand, not everybody is modeling. Gateways do not automatically become deployments in everybody's setup.
Yeah, and I think that's different. You know, it's not just limited to cloud providers, right? I hope that there are going to be implementations of this API that model to all kinds of different load balancing infrastructure on-prem, et cetera, like things that are not currently in our set of implementations. I don't want to back ourselves too far into a corner and say that, you know, in the vast majority of cases, gateways are going to be represented by a set of pods. So I think there will be other mechanisms other than just cloud providers to deploy a gateway. At least that's my perspective. I could be wrong on this.
By the way, this will be amazing KubeCon talk, so there's your ticket. I think like the struggle I have with this is how useful it is to generalize it as like an API construct or like something that the community is required to implement versus like, hey, here are some really good best practices. And we found that this works and this doesn't, and we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel among the different providers. Also, just it probably needs some experience to inform the design. I don't know how far people have gotten. But again, this is your ticket to KubeCon.
We've gotten as far as I wanted to have this conversation. Although I'm confused by that. Maybe that's not what you meant. It sounded like you were like, how far has this thought gone?
What I
And
meant is like if we turn it into, I guess I went one step further than you, which is like, okay, and then what kind of like API or like what would be the result of that? And that one I was like, do we have sort of the experience with the user base to know what makes sense in terms of trade-offs? But I do echo Rob's like, how generalizable is this? I think it's definitely useful to understand how people have been doing it, but to like mandate it as a requirement, it's less clear.
Yeah, I guess in the end that I think when I said before that I found it scary, I think that comes down to that's really what the heart of it is for me, that it feels like something that would be difficult to generalize correctly. And at the same time, yeah, like it would require a lot of specific experience to then be able to generalize it correctly. Because I certainly don't have a good intuition about how I would write something about that. So yeah, I think, like, I guess from my point of view, I'm like, I'm not a no. I'd like to see some more about this. But it does also feel like, yeah, like it feels like we've got a lot on already as well.
yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
If nobody else has, does anybody else have any? Oh, sorry, I can't really see you guys right now. Go ahead, somebody talking. I was going to say, if nobody else has any burnt.
Yeah, Micaiah.
Go on.
Just a question, when you talk about generalizing, to me, it seems like it's either an implementation supports it or not, because the scale API is extremely specific. To make a resource scalable, you need a /scale subresource that has, I think it's a selector to identify the thing you're scaling, and I think and a field saying how many replicas do you currently have, something like that. So when we say generalizable, are we saying how generally applicable, or is there something we could do that would make this API more or less general?
I think, since you're mentioning that, I think one of my questions about this would be, how meaningful is it? The scaling API is something that is well known, and there's, I believe some efforts to make traffic-based auto scaling a thing, right? Or some concept of that for deployments, right? So if you have a deployment that's backing gateway that can support auto scaling, is that significantly different than a gateway that maps directly to pods? That I'm not sure, and I don't want to. I think there's more. Somebody needs to sketch this out in a little bit more detail. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole quite yet, but I'm a little curious if we can, model the same thing a little bit differently.
Yeah. So what I'm gathering, so we've gone at this for a little over 10 minutes, so I don't want to hog too much time with this because it was just meant to kind of test the waters. I would characterize the response that I've heard so far is that there is interest. Nobody thinks that it's the worst idea ever. And generally people would like to see more to be convinced that they'd want to keep going with it. Does anybody feel like that's a bad characterization?
That sounds about right to me, but I think John had his hand up.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. One thing I would just note is that I don't want to scope creep things too much, but I do feel like there is a very large general problem of like customizing in cluster proxies, right? It's more than just auto scaling. Oftentimes there's, resource requirements and basically the whole deployment in service spec, potentially. I don't know how to solve that or that we need to, but we should at least take that into consideration when we're discussing anything that's, customizing any part of those, I think. We did have a long while back, we had some discussion of like classifying like types of deployments, but we never really standardized on any way for how this would work.
Did I paraphrase what you were getting at there well enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. That's a good thought. Yeah, the in cluster, the in cluster proxy thing is my life. I don't work on anything that does, anything like GKE. So I have found that the configuration for the gateways has been, right now, one of the ways that we do it is we have a gateway configuration CRD that you attach via parameters ref. We toyed with the notion of having other things, but that's just what we have for now. And it's not great, but it is the way you would do like some of the scaling stuff right now, theoretically. So it's a good thought, like maybe solving in general better how you do the configuration of a gateway might be something that would inform this more, but also just kind of solve a general problem we're all solving different ways. There may be ways to standardize on that. I think that was a really good point and thought. I can't see, so if somebody else has their hand raised, just start, interrupting me. But I think the action item for this then is thank you all for the feedback on the thought. I think the action item is I'm going to think about it and maybe bring up a discussion with something a little bit meatier, like start or even reach out to individuals and just kind of see how everybody's doing this and come back around to this with another discussion with more meat and potatoes to it. So. Cool, I'll do that. And if nobody else has anything else on that topic, I'd like to jump to the next topic. All right, so the next thing that I got here is that I wanted to talk about is just I've had two people recently that are in European time zones tell me that they want to come to this meeting, but it's too late. And so I know we've talked about it before, and I just wanted to like, is there anybody on this call that would like an earlier, like to do the alternating thing, kind of like what we're doing for Gamma? Anybody opposed to it? Trying to switch this to an alternating?
Switching this to alternating means I'll only make every second one. Making it 7 hours earlier puts it at 1 a.m. my time. And 1 a.m. my time
Gotcha.
in your summer, it'll be 3 a.m. my time in your winter. So look, I'm only one guy, so like it doesn't really, like to some extent it doesn't make sense to hold everything up for me. But yeah, that's why I'm on this one.
I think I would also, for a little bit of historical context, for some period of time, we did rotate between times that were friendly to Europe and times that were friendly to APAC. What ended up happening, and this was at least a year ago now, is that the people attending the Europe-friendly time zone meeting were a subset of the people attending the APAC-friendly time. And we didn't miss anyone by switching to the APAC-friendly time. I'm not saying that would happen today. That's just what happened historically. It was a lot of, it was challenging in the sense that there were meetings that were significantly larger than other meetings. So if you had a big proposal, you try and save it for the bigger APAC meeting, as an example, because more people would be there. Another concern that I'd have is if it were Monday morning Pacific, like if we just took this meeting time and bumped it up 7 hours, that would be asking people like myself in Pacific time to come to a meeting at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, which may not be fun for me, at least. That is a tiny complaint compared to what everyone else is dealing with as far as time zone. So I can't, whatever. My personal preference here would be to wait and see a little bit longer how Gamma does with this, since they're really kind of pioneering this idea again. And I think they have had decent turnout for both. But maybe someone who's more involved. I don't know. Keith, I think you're on this call. John, have you any thoughts on your experience so far with alternating time zones?
Yeah, so this is actually part of the status update I was going to I've got on the agenda here, but we've seen pretty good attendance for both meetings. As a cursory glance, I don't necessarily see folks that we consistently gain with the morning meeting, but there are some times where we have more people show up to the morning meeting. So I guess it remains to be seen. We've still got around 12 to 15 people each occurrence. So that tells me that something is going well. So and the thing with us is that we've got we've got leads across the entire continental United States when it comes to time zones. So we're swapping duties, which makes it a bit more sustainable. So I guess my takeaway is to keep that going until we see reason not to. I don't know. I think John had to step away, but Mike, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we don't have a lot of evidence in terms of like folks that are only able to make the EMEA friendly meeting, but it's certainly
Your dog every time.
yeah, every time, yeah. But yeah, as far as rotating hosts, 11 a.m. Eastern is I'm working on hosting those ones. So sorry about the dog.
So what I kind of missed what you were adding to the thing here, Mike. Sorry. Hello.
I'm gonna just type it out.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea.
Okay. Okay. Actually, yeah, if you just put your thoughts in there, that way next time we come back to this, we can actually, I'm trying to take notes today because I realize there's some things we come back to every once in a while. And so having notes could be helpful. I'm okay with waiting. I think the idea of just waiting a little bit longer to see what's going on with Gamma. Gamma looks promising, right? The meetings are working, but it's mostly in terms of it looks promising. Attendance is actually happening, not necessarily we are gaining anyone. So maybe just take a little bit more time and keep an eye on that. Sounds like Keith's already specifically trying to kind of keep an eye on that and use that to inform a decision. In the meantime, for the couple of people I know that are like want to come, but it's prohibitively late, I will I don't know, I'll talk to them a little bit more and tell them that. So
Yeah, maybe if you could ask them to add something to the agenda, like maybe comment on this thread or somewhere, just so we have an idea of the people that are just waiting for an earlier time to attend. That could help too.
yeah, sounds good.
You also
All right.
gave me an idea, Rob. I'll put this as I put it as an agenda item on our next Gamma EMEA meeting, just to ask folks if they're enjoying the flexibility of the other time to maybe more directly gauge. So I should have an update in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good. All right, and on that note, Keith, do you want to do the rest of your Gamma status update?
Sure. I made a slide deck just for folks who might not be able to, who might not be here today. as well as anybody who wants to reference back to it. How do you want to do you just want to continue sharing your screen?
No, I'll stop and let you share your screen.
Cool. Do the screen sharing dance. You gotta allow me to, as host, you gotta allow me to screen share.
You got it. One sec. Does that work?
Yes, it does. Thanks so much.
Mhm.
And I'm not gonna blow it up just because that always sucks for me trying to do the full screen thing. But yeah, so just a quick status update on Gamma and where we are. When we kind of started the Gamma initiative, it was suggested that we do these kinds of recurrent status updates so that folks who might not have the time to attend Gamma meetings or just people who are otherwise interested in Gamma can get a update every so often of what's going on. This is kind of a high-level overview slide of how things are going. We've had 4 meetings. This is about a month since our original meeting, kickoff meeting on July 26th. We are, as has been mentioned, alternating time slots to help different time zones. We've got solid attendance between both time slots, around 12, 13 people. The first meeting had around, I think, 32 attendees when we started. So that was really cool to see that kind of interest of the stuff that we're doing for Service Mesh and Gateway API. We started keeping track of organizations across different Gamma meetings, and I went through and did a count of all the different organizations that are represented here. There have been 14 different organizations. I think with Nick's new org change, 15 once he starts coming to a Gamma meeting. So we've got pretty wide interest across the community as well, which is very exciting. We've got our first Get merged as of last week. We got Get 1324 merged into Gateway API repo. Yeah, get the claps going. This is a high level kind of just talking about the goals, non-goals, and the places where we're explicitly cutting scope and deferring certain goals for things. And we'll get more into detail about that. And then just a quick kind of up next section that we'll go into more detail about. We've got 2 more cornerstone gets that are in progress. I say cornerstone because these are kind of the foundation of what a mesh needs. What a mesh needs to be able to be, to express it in Gateway API. So where are we now? Does somebody say something?
Go ahead.
Okay. So where are we now? The what and the why have been clearly established. We were trying to be very intentional about establishing what we're trying to accomplish and why we were solving those problems before digging too deep into implementation detail. And this Get 1324 covers that. I'll call out to pay special attention to this glossary. We went through this on the last Gamma call, but we've got this really cool glossary here that goes through a lot of terms that are going to be important for having mesh conversations. And some of these might even be broadly applicable to Gateway API. There's also a deferred goals section, which are things we're explicitly not excluding, but we're going to revisit. Some might be disappointed to find their favorite use case here, but we're hoping to iterate quickly, and cutting the scope is going to help us to get something out there a lot sooner. And now at this point, we're ready to set our sights on the how. We've got 2 GEPs around mesh representation and then mesh service binding that we're going to start really digging into the meat towards. I don't even know if that's correct English, but whatever, in our next meetings. So we'll probably start with mesh representation first. And then once we decide how to represent a mesh within Gateway API, we'll figure out how to start binding routes between services and back to the overall mesh construct. As in general, we're hoping to bias towards action in these early days. Had a lot of conversations about striking that balance, making sure we're not going to regret, some of the precedents and actions that we take. But the kind of answer to that is we hope to try to keep scope small and iterate very quickly. We've got about 2 months from now until KubeCon, and we hope to have these 2 gaps knocked out by then and have something that implementations can start implementing, at least generally. Opportunities for alignment. I think it's really important because of the nature of kind of these two work streams between ingress from the main gateway API meeting and the service mesh with Gamma, that we call out opportunities for us to align and work together. And so calling a few of those out here, we're currently evaluating the need for a GEP or some other clarification around DNS. DNS has popped up a lot in some of our recent conversation, and the greater gateway API kind of the ingress use case has kind of been able to sidestep that, it seems, because the binding happens directly to service resources or to other like Kubernetes resources that exist within etcd. When you start dealing with host name though, in intersecting traffic for destinations like you do with the mesh, we might not be able to get around some sort of clarification for DNS. Whether or not a GEP is the right place for that, not sure yet, but we're going to be exploring that as well in some of our Gamma meetings. The next one, and I think you caught this out in the last week's Gateway API meeting, is we're going to need a GEP around egress. Excuse me. There's been a lot of questions and conversation around egress for Gateway API, just for like the egress gateway use case. External name services and things of that nature, and Gamma as a service mesh use case group. We naturally have some concerns around or some questions around egress as well, and we're seeking a champion. I think that was the consensus around the Gateway API ingress use case meeting, and I think there was even commented on a discussion or an issue somewhere. If you happen to be really passionate around the egress use case, that's a pain point for you in your implementation, then please, we would love for somebody to come and to take this all the way and teach me some things, because it's a complicated problem and to do well. And the third one is Get 1282, that Nick's kind of pioneering around backend properties. It's the provisional PR has been submitted, and it will likely impact our service attachment GEP. So perhaps we're binding to this backend properties resource instead of an actual service. That's going to depend on some of the implementation, some of the how that's not yet been decided upon when it comes to the 1282 GET. So Gamma would very much like to be a part of that conversation. Love to try to work together around this. And then one thing I'll call out here is that specifically a part of the Gamma glossary for this GEP is this duality between a Kubernetes service being a front end and a back end. And I'll call this out because Shane on this GEP 1324 PR, you called this out as something that's been talked about before within Gateway API. And it might make sense to start with the backend properties GEP already in progress. Maybe it makes sense to bring this over to the ingress use case with Gateway API. I don't care about the names, but this concept of, the Kubernetes service resource serves two functions, one as a front end that can be addressable and referenced, and the back end representing a set of endpoints or addressable hosts, depending on your proxy terminology. So that's something I'll call out there for some folks who are really embedded within the ingress use case of Gateway API to see if this might be useful in some upstream conversations. So that's the end of kind of my status update for everybody. I'll go ahead and keep sharing my screen in case there's any questions or clarifications, something folks might want to see for next status update or anything like that.
I'd just say great update, man. Cool slides.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I echo the same thing. I really appreciate how you all have taken Gamma on and just run with it. And this is great progress for just being a month in. Yeah, thanks for the update.
No problem.
I like that you're looking at all the pieces connecting to each other, the backend properties, service front end and backend, which is something that I want to help with at some point because I have a use case for. So good job kind of looking at the whole picture and taking it piece by piece.
Appreciate it. Yeah, so I will, like I said, this slide deck is within the meeting notes for this meeting. So if you're watching this recording and you want to see this or add comments, it should be commentable to everybody. So feel free to take it however. We don't, I want to ask, do we want to figure out when the next status update should be? Establish a cadence perhaps? I'm fine with it being ad hoc, but I don't know if anybody has preference for more structure or not.
I
I'm
could go
personally
either
okay
way.
with. Sorry, Rob.
No, sorry, yeah, either way, but I would say, every month seems like a fine cadence. But also if you wanted to, if there's something like that you want to bring and discuss in more detail, then we could do that too. But at least in these early days, making sure it's, once a month or so, at least so we're not going too far in different directions, seems reasonable.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say once a month is a good goal, and they don't need to be huge if they can't be huge, right? Like this was a great update, but if in a month's time we don't have an update this big, that's fine. Like,
Yep, sounds good to me. I'm even if the update's not big, I do want to try to make sure we call me or whoever is making these calls out the opportunities for alignment here. Because I think that's one of the big benefits of having this kind of status update is how can we bring these work streams together to make sure that we're moving in the same direction. So, all right, appreciate the opportunity to share. I'll turn it back over to you, Shane.
all right. Thank you, Keith. Back to it. Good update. Rob, you want to talk about versioning updates?
Yeah, okay, so I've got a few things going on here. Hopefully I got them in the right order. They're all pretty related. One is trying to document our versioning plan for future releases of the API. I don't think we've documented that anywhere right now. I have a rough proposal of what I would write in this issue, and I've assigned it to myself, so I'll work on a PR that does this. But the high level thing here is maybe worth discussing a little bit more, and that is that talking to some people in API machinery around how they would recommend we do this, the overwhelming reaction I got was to avoid supporting Alpha 2 longer than you have to. I'm fine with supporting Beta 1 for a long time, maybe forever. But Alpha 2, it doesn't seem like there's any reason we want users to keep on using V1 Alpha 2 anywhere. Our docs have all said V1 Beta 1 for a month plus now. So with that said, the recommendation would be to set the new version, V1 Beta 1, as storage in 060 and stop serving the old API version, which is V1 Alpha 2. So the old API version would still exist in the CRD. So that means that if anyone has resources that haven't updated yet, whatever, they're still supported, but it means that if anyone tries to write or to update or create a resource using V1 Alpha 2 of the API, it will get rejected using the V060 CRDs. So old resources still work. Controllers that are reading from V1 Beta 1 still understand V1 Alpha 2 resources. It's all good. It's just starting in 060. If you use those CRDs and you try and write or update a resource with V1 Alpha 2, it's not going to work. That's the proposal. For some context, this is something that we are planning to get ahead of with GK. With the, we have no plans of installing alpha API versions in our managed product. So if you're using Gateway API, you're going to see this experience a little bit sooner on GK of just you only get beta as the exposed API. There's also a reference to the idea of kube storage version migrator. We're going to need to work on something that makes this a little easier for users to understand. But if we ever remove V1 Alpha 2 from the CRD completely, instead of just not serving it, but just also not including it at all. We'll need to make sure that users that created something with V1 Alpha 2 have done something to update their resources when V1 Beta 1 was a storage version. Storage version migrator does that automatically. It just bumps a resource and says, hey, you're not using the right storage version, and it just bumps you up automatically. There may be a simpler tool to use, whatever, but we'll need something like this in our documentation before we remove V1 Alpha 2 completely.
I took a look at using Cube Storage Version Migrator as part of our recent upgrade to get users from V1 Alpha 2 to the comparable V1 Beta 1 resources. And I think the most unexpected thing for me was to just automatically upgraded everything in the cluster.
Yeah. Which I think we probably want a more targeted.
It's a feature.
Yeah. You would hope that's a low risk thing, but I think we probably want a more targeted thing that just targets gateway resources, because that's something that I'm intending to work on. And the related PRs, I guess we can go through those now, are really the same thing. Well, actually, maybe let's go to the next PR first, because that lines up more closely with the documentation. This makes that change. My goal is to get it in before 060. I think it's ready to go now. I don't see any reason to hold off on it, but it ended up being a cascading change, in that what turned into, it started with, I'm going to change 3 lines in the types files. And then I realized, well, hold on a second, I need to change the examples, because we don't need V1 Alpha 2 examples anymore in many cases. And then I need to update the docs to make sure they're including the related things. I tried to cover the very specific changes that I'm doing in this PR. It is massive, but most of it is just 1 line changes in a variety of files. And the removal of a bunch of V1 Alpha 2 examples that no longer are useful. That's the big change that kind of implements what I was suggesting documenting. Before I go any further, any questions or concerns about this kind of change? I know it's a big one, so I don't want to rush it in or anything.
I think it's awesome.
Okay, cool. Yeah, great. So then the next one, we'll go to the supported versions one. Thank you. This is more of just if you are launching, I think many or most of us on this call are planning on launching or building a product around this API. And it would be very helpful to have some kind of guarantees that the API will be stable. So this tries to make some commitments in that vein. So one, right now our docs just say, well, right now, just because we support up to 118 backwards compat and 116 if you're not using that protocol, a variety of things like that. But we don't have any commitment that that will forever be the case. So first step is, let's say we're going to support at least the most recent 5 Kubernetes minor versions. I think the most relevant thing that could be frustrating with this is there's a new thing called CEL coming out for CRDs, which allows us to represent a lot of the validation we have in a webhook in the CRD itself. And by saying this, we're saying we're going to wait basically 5 Kubernetes minor versions before we make that transition to CEL instead of webhook validation.
2 years.
Yeah.
It's the better part of 2 years, just to be clear.
Yeah, it's a long time. So 5 years times 4 months. Yeah, at least 2 years.
That's a good reminder. Do we have like an actual issue reminder somewhere about that?
I don't think so. I think CL is just getting to beta in 125, so there's not really any usage of it yet. But a year from now, we may be regretting it and saying, "Oh man, I wish we could use CEL today."
Personally, I would bias us towards not not having 5. I think at the maximum we should do is the same as the upstream Kubernetes support, i.e. 3, 1 year. Because yeah, just because like I could talk for a whole hour about how long it took us to get to that in the LTS working group. But you know, like, I think that's about the best that we can do. Because otherwise we're going to be stuck. And it's hard enough to make changes already, and we're going to need to push changes to some stuff that takes a long time to change. And if we also have to not drop that until later, it's going to take us years and years and years to be able to make solid changes. And I think the CEL thing is going to be a very big deal. It's going to make the webhook a lot easier. Yeah, yes, I think that's it. Micaiah has put a link in the chat. Yeah, so yeah, being able to do the being able to use the being able to use that will be really helpful. We will be able to drop a lot of the stuff that's in the admission book as soon as we start using that. I mean, there's some stuff to be checked about, like, hey, if you put those into the CRD, the CRD specs, what happens if you apply it to an older cluster and stuff like that? If API machinery has done the usual thing, like hopefully you should you should be able to put them in there and say, if you're running a version older than this, run the admission webhook, otherwise use CEL in the meantime. But if that's not the case, then yeah, we're not going to be able to use it until the CEL feature is in GA in all the supported versions of Kubernetes that we support. And the more supported versions we do, the longer that will be.
Yeah.
I should get that in a comment on the PR then. I think that sounds wise.
I have a bias, this is a personal bias, to provide longer support than 3, for the reason that, users are coming to CRDs with the expectation that they can install these CRDs in any Kubernetes cluster. And if you look at what the majority of Kubernetes clusters running today are, they are likely older than 3 versions old. If you say 125 is out now or about to be out, 125, 24, 23, I don't think the majority of Kubernetes users are on 123 today. And I hate to artificially limit where this can be deployed just because we want to use the latest thing. And I know that there has to be a balance here, and I don't want to push too far the other direction. I just want to be clear that right now we have an API that we say, if you're running a Kubernetes cluster, our API works. And what we would say, if we say the latest 3 Kubernetes versions, would be is maybe half of Kubernetes clusters are supported by our API, which is a change and may not be expected with the CRD. I don't know, Keith, you've got a hand.
Yeah, I guess putting this another way, I don't know how I feel about CRDs because you're not encouraging usage of out of support clusters, but you're not discouraging the use of out of support clusters. And I get what you're saying, but it becomes tricky because that's a switch or that's a knob for users to have them adopt to a safer, more secure version of Kubernetes. And I don't know, my little experience makes me feel like we should, as a community, try to use those knobs where appropriate. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I think to add to that, this is only an issue because we are delivering this with CRDs. If we were building this in tree, then there would be no question, right? Like this would have to be only 3 versions because that's how in tree works. We are an upstream API. The fact that we're being delivered with CRDs feels like an implementation detour to me. And so that's why I'm pretty strongly on the case on the side of 3 only. I know that you're 100% right, Rob, that CRDs do have a slightly different support expectation, but equally, I think we just need to manage the expectation like in our release notes and talk about it in these meetings and talk about it in calls and make sure that that's clearly communicated. That, hey, you know, these might work, you know, in order clusters, but like we'd like you to try and we're encouraging you to try and move a bit faster than that, so that we can use this newer stuff that we need to be able to provide you with a better, you know, with a better experience at the end of the day. Not having to run on a mission webhook, I think, is a very big deal, and would be really nice.
I get that. Maybe a question for other maintainers on the call, including you, Nick, would be, you know, for your implementation, what version range do you support with the latest release? What Kubernetes version range? Do you support trailing 3, or is it a wider range than that?
For Contour, I'm not a maintainer there anymore, but for Contour supports 3, and has for a long time because of me. So I was like, not 3 only, end of story. It'll work back down to like 116 or something like that. But the explicit support is for only 3 because of this sort of problem. Because you don't want to have to wait, you know, in the case of, you know, Ingress V1 is the classic one here, right? Like you don't, you know, the transition from V1 to Beta 1 to V1 took forever, and then it still screwed people because people weren't looking for it and didn't know that that sort of thing could happen. You know, the removal of V1 Beta 1 really surprised a lot of people, and people were shocked. And so, you know, I think that the way to stop that from happening is to ensure that you're telling people you can't just keep your 112 Kubernetes cluster around forever, right? Like you have to keep upgrading it just like any other software. And I know, Rob, that one of the reasons is that all the big cloud providers don't usually stick within the supported window, right? Like it's very uncommon that all the big cloud providers have their managed Kubernetes clusters within that supported window. Like, and so yeah, like that kind of sucks too. And so like, but from like wearing my upstream hat, it's better for upstream for us to keep it to the 3 things. I acknowledge the practical problems of, you know, managed platforms needing to qualify new versions of Kubernetes, you know, and it taking a very long time. And so it's very difficult for the managed platforms to keep their managed versions within the supported Kubernetes versions. But like, I mean, I'm going to be facetious about it, but like that seems like a you problem. Like as far as wearing my upstream hat, right? Like, you know, it's like, hey, that's a you know, that's like well, we got to do what's best for the upstream, and then everyone else needs to figure themselves out, right? Like, you know, and like I don't want to change the upstream stuff to like, yeah, I don't want to acknowledge that too much, you know what I mean? Like, you know, it's like, hey, I know that there's a lot of work there, I know that there's practical reasons, but I think it's better for the official support position to be 3, same as the rest of it, and for us to manage the expectation issues separately. Personally, sorry, I've talked a lot.
No, that's very helpful, and I want to share, and I think you alluded to it earlier with Ingress, right? I am very familiar of the pain I caused with Ingress, and I know we had multiple implementers come to us and say, you know, this really hurts. The idea that there is really
by the way, sorry.
Yeah. that there were 3 supported versions that had both V1 and V1 Beta 1. And if you wanted to support anything outside of that range, you needed to either, you know, provide parallel support, or you needed to have different versions that you released. And, you know, big implementations, Ingress Nginx and several others that I can't remember the name of right now, had issues with this where they supported a bigger range of versions than that 3. And it was a really rough transition for the community as a whole as a result. There's no perfect number here, but we do have prior experience that 3 can be painful. And we can continue this discussion on the PR, but I want to avoid that kind of painful transition again. And especially with CRDs, where the thing is, we just don't want to maintain a webhook for say 4 more months or whatever it is, right? You know, maybe that pain is acceptable if it means a better transition for the rest of the community. I'm not sure. Shane, I think you're up.
Part of my thing is we're at time. I would like to, I mean, the action seems pretty obvious to have the conversation in the issue, or rather in the PR. I'm leaning Nick's way, to be honest with you. I mean, it's, to me, it seems like what we're really, we'll always try to support far back. Like we at Kong, we can get you running on some pretty old versions of Kubernetes. We don't want to be beholden to that. And that's kind of the key here, right? That's at the end of the day, we'll put some effort, but we don't want to be beholden to an inordinate amount of effort to try to keep you on an old version. At some point, you got to give, and as the end user, you got to be like, all right, I just need to update my cluster. It's 5 versions behind, you know. So I kind of lean that way, but I'll comment on the thing, because honestly, I kind of thumbs it up at first, and then now after hearing this, I'm like, yeah, no, I kind of agree with a shorter span, because 5 is a lot. So
I think that, as Keith said, best effort is a magical phrase. I think that putting some stuff in there to say, hey, three versions being the supported version doesn't mean that we're gonna always hard drop things. We will make every effort to make sure that a longer support, that the API works on longer versions. Like we'll do our best efforts to make sure that the API works on longer versions of that. But we're only going to guarantee 3. Is I think the thing that we need to say, like because as I think you're right, Rob, that the amount of effort in maintaining the extra webhook as well is probably not that much. What I'm worried about is if there's no easy way that your CRDs can have CEL enabled and not have it enabled, then you're kind of then you're kind of screwed, right? Like, if you can't have the CEL stuff in the CRDs and have them apply to older clusters, then that means that we then have to write, like, not only do we have to have standard and experimental, we need to have the CEL fork of the CRDs plus the non-CEL fork of the CRDs. And that we will then have to maintain for a period of at least a year under the 5 thing. And that will suck even more than, having to manage a transition for people.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm worried
Yeah,
about.
I'll follow up on the issue. I'm not convinced yet, but I understand, and I also understand I'm outnumbered right now. So I'll try and make my best case, but we'll defer to the community for sure.
Yeah.
all right, well, we don't have any time for anything else, but all we had left on the agenda was triage. So please just make sure to check out the recent PRs and issues and stuff like that if you have time, if there's anything that piques your interest, and get some feedback on them. But we'll check in again on them on next Monday. Thanks everybody for coming, and have a good one.
Thanks.